Jason, I appreciate you doing this, man.
I'm glad to be here, Ramon. I really appreciate you reading the book and taking an interest in it. That was great.
The book Elway, man. It's a tremendous read. Very extensive look of John Elway. If you can you please just give me, if you can explain the writing process for this book?
Well, I approached John in 2014 to do this and talked to him. I talked to him many times over the years because I've covered the NFL since 1992 as a reporter. So I got to know him both as a player and his NFL career, and as an executive. I also went to Stanford with him and knew of him. I wouldn't say we were friends there, but I certainly watched his exploits in college. So I had tremendous background understanding. My best friends and I, from college, we're all Elway fans. So this is sort of a passion project, and so you keep track of somebody over the years, and you take notes about somebody over the years, and you think about it. And then 2014 is when I formally started this. And then over the next couple of years, I interviewed over 200 people about him, including him and his family. And then sat down, did some of the writing early on, then progressed and did more writing, and then refined it and refined it and refined it. And then basically over the last 2 years has been an editing process, because really we sold the book in early 2019, and it was scheduled for this year. So basically the book publishers had it for a couple of years, and I've been working on it with them for a couple of years. So it's torturous sometimes, getting information out of people, because I'm a reporter first and a writer second. And so you got to go get stories. And when I have taught journalism, I always tell people, like, you can't write it better than whatever the story of the background or the details are. So it's really incumbent upon you to get as many details as possible. And I think that, the final thing I would say is there's this great profile that was done of Frank Sinatra years and years ago. It's sort of the ultimate feature story about Frank Sinatra. It was written by the writer Gay Talese. And Talese never actually talked to Sinatra because Sinatra didn't want to talk to him. He was in one of his funks, kind of in a mood, and just didn't want the publicity, right? So Talese ended up talking to like 60 people around him about Sinatra. And I think that this book is talking to people about Elway and about how he grew up and who his parents were and what the influences were along the way, more than it's just his voice. And that's what I'm really proud of, that part of it, and happy with that part of it. I think it's my sort of Gay Talese moment as a writer.
Well said. When you're writing this book and you're interviewing over 200 people, which individual stood out and why?
Ooh, that's a good question. The person who stands out to me as a character, so I'll answer this two different ways. The person who stands out as a character to me would probably be actually two people. It would be Jack Neumeyer, who was his high school coach, and it would be Edgar Kaiser, who was the owner of the Broncos at the time. So I'll start with Neumeyer. Neumeyer was this classic 60s football coach, 3 yards in a cloud of dust guy, who never sort of was able to get over the hump, so to speak, with Granada Hills High School. And so he had this, when he lost this with this great team and couldn't get to the playoffs, and he was about to lose his job as a high school coach, which he had incredible pride in because he had grown up in the San Fernando Valley. He had been a football player. This was very much a part of his identity to be a football coach. He went through this epiphany of changing his entire style in a way that was so counter to the culture of football in 1970. And for him to do that, to take that kind of chance and to adopt this wide open offensive style, which later is a big part of Elway becoming a quarterback, because he shows up there 6 years later at Granada Hills High School, and he walks into this great system for a quarterback. But the fact that the coach was willing to make that huge change, it makes him an interesting character. Unfortunately, he passed away before I was ever able to talk to him. But people talked about him and this monumental change that he went through as a person, which ultimately has this influence on Elway. And the second person is Edgar Kaiser, who also unfortunately passed away before I was able to write this book. And he was the owner of the Denver Broncos for just 2 years, but the 2 years when they made the Elway trade. And I'm stunned by this always, is the people who were trying to trade for Elway in 1983 included the Dallas Cowboys, who had Tom Landry, Tex Schramm, and Gil Brandt, 3 Hall of Fame executives / head coaches. Al Davis was in on this one, right? Don Coryell, who should be in the Hall of Fame. Chuck Knox, who was a coach who won over 200 games and was constantly in the playoffs. Don Shula even sniffed around this. Bill Walsh sniffed around trading for Elway. So here's all these Hall of Famers and great coaches, legends of the game, who are trying to make a deal for Elway. They're lifers in the game, right? And Edgar Kaiser, this guy out of nowhere who bought the Broncos on a whim, executed this trade because of his sort of ability to finesse relationships and get to know people. And so he was that other fascinating character. In terms of an interview, I would say it was Edgar Kaiser's right-hand man. If you ever read the chapter about how the Broncos pulled off this trade, Hein Paulus had this incredible details and was fascinating because Hein Paulus knew nothing about football, basically. And he was the general manager, so to speak, of the Broncos. And he basically helped Kaiser. Kaiser figured out how to get the trade to happen. Paulus figured out all the details, right? Getting the contract done, negotiating with Marvin Demoff, making sure it all could come together. And that was a guy who knew absolutely zero about football, as he will admit, doesn't know if a football is pumped or stuffed. That's Hein Paulus's own, admittedly his own analysis of himself. And he helped do this. So that fascinated me. That chapter fascinates me about how they did this trade, because it wasn't any of the football people. Dan Reeves, John Beek, none of the people on the football side thought they could ever do this. Edgar Kaiser thought they could do this, and Hein Paulus made the details work.
You talked a little bit about the 1983 draft, which have a multitude of Hall of Famers in that draft. Explain why that draft is very important, because, as you said, he was selected first overall pick with the Baltimore Colts, and down the line that became a problem that same night. So if you can just explain that story.
Sure. Well, there's 2 parts to it. I think that the class of '83 is important because starting in the late 70s, around 76, 77, the league understands that this low-scoring defensive-oriented football that's dominated by the Steelers and the Steel Curtain defense, and the Minnesota Vikings with the Purple People Eaters, and Dallas with the Doomsday defense, all these, the Dolphins with, the no-name defense, and then the Killer Bees, and, it's defense, right? There's no scoring. It's just boring. It's boring-ass football, right? Like, nobody wants to watch this, okay? And so they say, look, we got to open up the scoring. We got to do something. So they change the rules, and they make it so that it's easier to throw. And ever since then, they've made it easier and easier. Well, this causes quarterbacks to be more important. And that leads basically to Joe Montana getting drafted in '79, and then you get the Bill Walsh offense starts to take over, and you get this huge shift from the NFL being about the generals, if that makes sense, like the guys like Tom Landry, Chuck Noll, Don Shula, Paul Brown, Vince Lombardi. Football back then was, those guys were like George Patton, standing on the sideline and kind of gleaming down. But all of a sudden in the early 80s, it's like, okay, this is going to be about the quarterbacks, right? And it's like
Right.
an explosion of these guys. And 83 gives you the guys who are the really talented throwers. Now, there have been some talented throwers before, Joe Namath and Unitas and Tarkenton and stuff like that. But all of a sudden, you push like 6 guys in the first round. And all of a sudden, it's the quarterback is the central character to what football is going to be. And 3 of those guys become Hall of Famers with Elway. Marino and Kelly. One of them has a very good career. That's Ken O'Brien. Tony Eason goes to a Super Bowl, helps New England get to a Super Bowl. Todd Blackledge, he's the one guy who's a bust in that class. Okay, but that's a phenomenal class of quarterbacks as part of what might be the greatest draft overall. If you go back, I think there are 6 total Hall of Famers in that first round. It's a star-studded first round in 1983 overall. Darrell Green and Eric Dickerson and all those guys are in there. Kurt Warner's in there. It's fabulous, right? So, but the quarterback is important, and all of a sudden it becomes a quarterback league, not a coach league anymore. So that's sort of a long answer to the first part of what you're saying. Now, the Baltimore thing, look, there were 2 factors that Elway and his father took into account. And those 2 factors were 2 people. That was Frank Kush, who was the head coach of the Baltimore Colts, but more importantly, Bob Irsay, who was the owner of the Colts. Frank Kush was a former college coach who got in trouble at Arizona State because he slugged his punter one time. It's one of those crazy-ass stories, right? And Jack Elway knew Frank Kush. And Jack Elway knew in his heart, there's no way he's letting his kid play for Frank Kush. It just was Frank Kush was the antithesis of everything Jack was. So no way he's going to do that. But more importantly, Bob Irsay was probably a notorious drunk who didn't get along with anybody in the league. Other owners hated him. He couldn't get along with the city of Baltimore to get a new stadium built. Was threatening to leave and ultimately did leave in 1984. That famous moment where he has moving trucks back up in the middle of the night. Moving trucks show up at their facility, take everything, and take it to Indianapolis. It's one of those crazy stories about the NFL. But Irsay was not a successful owner in any way, shape, or form. Ultimately, the success that the Colts had under the Irsay family came when his son, Jim, took over, and then they drafted Peyton Manning, obviously. So it took a while for them to get things straight. And so because that team was such a wreck, they had gone winless in 1982. They had traded away a great quarterback in Burt Jones. They had, they were tragic. And so between the 2 of them, Elway was never going to play for that team. Between the fact that Irsay owned them and Frank Kush coached them.
Right. I'm probably a little bit younger than you, but
I hope so. I hope so for you, Ramon.
But that situation in '83 ties back to when Eli Manning getting drafted by the San Diego Chargers, and we see how that turned out.
The funny part about it is, this is the irony of the whole thing is that Ernie Accorsi was the GM of the Colts at the time, with Baltimore,
right?
Who stood by his guns and said, "We're taking Elway with the number 1 overall pick." Now, Bob Irsay came in and kind of screwed up the whole trade, but it was Ernie Accorsi who made that happen, and that was Ernie Accorsi who was the beneficiary when San Diego took Eli Manning, because Ernie was the GM of the New York Giants at the time. So he's involved in both of those trades. I mean, it's a fantastic little story.
I like how in the beginning of the book you started off with Jack Elway and how he was just, I guess at that time, was a man's man. Explain his history.
Jack and John have very similar mannerisms in certain ways, not all of them, okay, but certainly as it comes to handling people and how they talk to people and how they treat them. I think there's a lot of similarities between those two. I think Jack was funnier on a regular basis. I think John is not as openly funny like that. But Jack was, this quick-witted, funny guy who knew how to bring people together. And, born in the Northwest, he's from, state of Washington, from a family of plumbers. So your typical sort of blue-collar work ethic, was an athlete himself who got recruited by Washington State, was a quarterback who evidently had a great arm as well, but, got hurt. So, ended up not being able to finish his football career in college. And he goes ahead and decides he's going to become a coach and stay in sports because this is what he wants to do his entire life. And gets his bachelor's, his master's along the way. Meets John's wife back in their hometown, and sets upon this career as a football coach. Basically dotting the Northwest between Montana and Washington until John gets to high school, and then by that time, Jack was an assistant coach, an offensive coordinator at Washington State. That went south. He had to go get a different job. They end up going down to California. That's sort of the brief history of Jack. What I would say about Jack is Jack knew how to get passion out of people. Jack knew how to read people really well. There's that great moment where he's he's talking to the basketball coach at Montana. The guy's name is escaping me. He's the guy who coached Magic Johnson at Michigan State. But he ends up realizing that this guy is not going to take the Montana job at the time because he hadn't heard the right things. And so they go and sit and have a beer. And he says, "Why aren't you going to take this job?" Like he already knew without the guy telling him that he wasn't going to take the job, that he wasn't comfortable with it. Where everybody else thought this guy was comfortable with the job, was going to take it, it was going to be great. And Jack knew. And then Jack knew how to solve that problem intuitively. And I think Jack also understood ultimately how to get the most out of John, how to push the buttons the right way. And I think that there's a great lesson in Jack that he never coached John directly. I mean, there's in all the time that that John's growing up, Jack only coached him in one game, and that was the Shrine All-Star College game, a meaningless game. After John was done with the senior year in college, right? He never coached him in Pee Wee football. He never coached him in Little League. He never coached him in high school. He never coached him in college. He left that part of it alone and became a great guide for John. And I think that that's because he never wanted to give John orders. He never wanted to be the coach who had to say, "You got to do it this way." And so he never let the coaching aspect get in the way of the interpersonal relationship between father and son, and that trust that you build up where you're looking at your dad saying, "Hey, can you help me? Can you guide me?" rather than order me. And I think that was really important for Jack and for John.
Right. This is probably more of a side question, but to add on what you were talking about, have you seen more success with the father-son relationship as it ties into football or even sports in general? Do you see more of a better relationship? Because there are moments where we do see the parent want to be the helicopter coach on the side.
I mean, look, I think you see both still. I mean, look, there's some kids out there, who have helicopter parents. Okay, I think some of the most famous are, Todd Marinovich, Marv Marinovich, who was sort of the ultimate helicopter dad. Wouldn't let his son eat McDonald's. Wouldn't let him have sugar, all that kind of stuff. Which is, it's just silly because it just makes him want to use it, to have it more. There's Drew Henson's dad, who famously used to show up at every practice when he was at the University of Michigan and watch, to the point that Lloyd Carr had to tell Henson's dad, "Look, you need to not be here all the time." And then Henson's dad would then drive up, park his car at a distance, and like watch from a distance in the car, right? There's the kid out of Michigan State a couple of years ago. I'm trying to remember. It's not Kirk Cousins. One kid who came afterwards who ended up being a 4th-round pick. Yeah, the dad was a helicopter dad. So there's lots of helicopter dads out there. And I think ultimately that's the wrong approach, because you got to let your kid run his life. You guide them, and then you let them do it and make mistakes on their own, and hopefully they come back to you and ask you for advice later on, right?
Right.
So I've seen that, but I've also seen a number of times where the parents, really kind of stay out of it. Man, Archie Manning didn't interfere too much with Eli and with Peyton. I wouldn't say that, he didn't tell them how to do things or how to run their life or any of that kind of stuff. He was obviously ever present, but he didn't like sit there and try and run practice. He let other people do that. And I think we've seen, Dan Marino, Marino's dad really let things be. And so I think that if you give your kids guidance most of the time and show them how to do something, and then let them go deal with the world, and that's both the positive and the negative. I tell my kids all the time, they'll say, well, my teacher sucks, or I don't like my boss, because my oldest is 25. I don't like this person I'm working for. I'm like, okay, well, welcome to the world. What are you going to do about it? You're not going to always like your teacher. You're not always going to like your boss. So how are you going to solve this in the meantime? And they, the first couple times I did that, they were like, but that's not helping me. I go, I can't. You have to help yourself. And that's, I think, the better approach for most dads.
Let's fast forward into now. John Elway he's well established in the team, and he lost a few Super Bowls. Has there been any talks, or has he felt at that moment, maybe I need to find another place to go to win?
No, I don't think there was never any talk of him wanting to leave Denver. Not from his angle.
Right.
Obviously, there's the great rumor about whether he was going to be traded by Dan Reeves. It's not a rumor so much as they had talks with Washington. Exactly what those talks were like, whether it was Washington making an offer and Reeves telling Pat Bowlen, the owner, look, there's an offer and you need to know about it, but I don't want to trade him, or Reeves saying, I want to trade him, and Bowlen saying no. There's confusion on that one. It depends on who you believe in that. And Elway has his belief, and Reeves maintains his side of it. But from John's perspective, I don't think he ever wanted to leave Denver. I think he loved Denver right from the beginning. I think that the other thing that is, look, he lived very much a coach's life, which is every 3 or 4 years, they were moving. They were, it was, let's go from Washington to Montana to back to Washington, back to Montana, then down to California, then, that's Southern California, up to Northern California. So this guy never lived in the same house for more than 3 or 4 years. And I think that wears on you over time. And I think he finally found a home in Denver in the literal sense, and said, this is where I want to, have a family. This is where I want to raise my kids. This is where I want to be. And there's this moment after the whole Washington trade fiasco where he says to himself, look, I'm not going to let the Broncos and Dan Reeves determine what my future is going to be. I have to build these other businesses and make money this other way, so that if football doesn't work out the way I want, I can say to them, I'm not doing that. I'm not going. I'm not going to be traded. I'm going to stay here. And he talks about that in the book, and that's one of the reasons he got into the car business ultimately.
In 1995, Mike Shanahan becomes the head coach of the Denver Broncos. Explain their relationship, because there's a lot of quarterbacks, they already well established, multiple Pro Bowls, maybe a couple All Pros, and a new coach comes in and maybe they're not, ready to adapt to their philosophy. So if you're able to just pontificate about their rapport.
Well, sure. I mean, I can pontificate all day long, unfortunately. But look, they knew each other because Shanahan had been a coach with under Dan Reeves already in Denver with the Broncos, and they had gotten to know each other. So they had that pre-established relationship that most coaches and quarterbacks don't have, which leads to sort of a disarray and dysfunction. Okay, but in this case they didn't have that. I think that the importance of Shanahan is that when Shanahan came in, he had been a quarterback at the college level. He understood the modern game a little bit more. He understood to give the quarterback more freedom, which was something that Dan Reeves didn't do. Reeves was very much an iron fist. We're going to run it this way. We're going to do it my way. I'm going to call the plays. You don't do it. You don't deviate until I say, go ahead and deviate. And that would be classic under Reeves. Is Elway they'd run the ball for 3 quarters, and then they get into the fourth quarter and it'd be a close game. And Reeves would basically say, well, go do your thing and go bail us out. And that's why Elway had all these fourth quarter comebacks. It's that the games were sort of artificially close all the time because of the way that Reeves coached the game. But Elway certainly was good at that, and Reeves leaned into that a lot. What Shanahan did is came in with some ideas about, okay, you played West Coast offense, the Bill Walsh offense when you were at Stanford, and why don't we adapt some more of those ideas and give you a little bit more freedom? The problem is that Reeves wasn't really into that, and they would go back and forth over who had control. And it got to the point where Reeves didn't trust Shanahan anymore, fired Shanahan because he thought Shanahan was going behind his back, which wasn't true. It was just Shanahan happened to have a good relationship with Elway, and Reeves had a negative relationship with Elway. And ultimately, as time went on, Elway realized he was having his best success under Shanahan and wanted Shanahan back. And when finally the relationship between Reeves and Elway reached a point where they could no longer coexist and the team wasn't getting any better, and Pat Mullen made a decision to fire him, he couldn't get Shanahan right away. He had to wait a couple of years, but he finally got Shanahan to take over in 1995. And that's where, in the strangest way, offensively, Elway's career takes off from a statistical standpoint. Elway, over the next 4 years, has the 4 best statistical seasons of his entire career under Shanahan because they had that trust, because they had built up an understanding that Shanahan was going to let him do it his way and give him more freedom to run it. And Elway understood, I have to have a running game, and I'm going to buy into what Shanahan's doing with the running game. So it was a perfect marriage at that point in time, but it had developed over time. It was not something that they were trying to create in 1995 by itself. It had happened over a series of 7 or 8 years.
How was John Elway in the locker room? And to add on top of that, who was a person in this camp was, or within the realm of the team that I don't want to say friend, but more of an associate that he was close to?
Well, I would say that most people overwhelmingly admire and look up to Elway among his teammates. I don't know that everybody was incredibly close to Elway because some guys just didn't develop that kind of bond or that relationship with him. But the offensive linemen certainly did because, famously, Jack Elway used to tell John all the time, make sure that when you go out, this saying is framed on the wall of Elway's office with the Broncos. So make sure that when you go out with your offensive lineman, you always pick up the tab, right?
Right.
So he would take care of those guys. He would make sure, when they went out on a Wednesday or Thursday night during the week, typically he would lead the way. He would take care of those guys, and they appreciated that. So he developed that bond with the offensive lineman. I think some of the wide receivers he has a bond with, certainly with Shannon Sharp. He's got a bond with Shannon Sharp that's very strong. Rod Smith, like during training camp, he used to go and shoot dice with those guys in their dorm room. He'd play cards with them. But not every single guy on the team had that tight kind of bond. But they all have a really high respect for him because he worked all the time. Like, he showed up every single day. He's a typical first in, last out guy.
Wow.
And when you're like that, then and you're not big time in anybody because you're the quarterback, and everybody knows that you're taking care of everybody, that gets around the locker room. That everybody respects that. So whether you're really friends with this guy or not, you become tight with him. I think there are several guys that he played with who he's close with, guys like Michael Young that he was close with, who was a wide receiver. I think, a couple of the offensive linemen like Gary Zimmerman, he was close with. I think that probably the guy that he has the best relationship, however, was Gary Kubiak. I think that those guys were best friends because they came in together, and Kubiak became his confidant. Kubiak became the guy who he could go to. I mean, Kubiak and later became an offensive coordinator when Shanahan returned. So they have probably the closest relationship. They know each other as friends probably better than anybody else. And that's why Kubiak was the guy who, in each of John's final 2 seasons, that Kubiak was the guy who would go to him and say, okay, look, are you coming back for another year or not? That's the guy that Shanahan would send to find out what was going on with Elway, because Kubiak could ask that question like a friend, and Elway knew how to talk to him about it. And so the Kubiak is the guy, I would say.
His last 2 seasons, 98, 99.
Mm-hmm.
2 times.
97, 98.
97, 98. He won the championships in 98, 99.
Right, exactly.
Is his legacy is different if he does not win those championships?
Of course. I mean, they're talking about, is he the greatest quarterback to never win a Super Bowl, right? Which is Marino. And then you've got the whole thing about, class of 83, is it a disappointment? Is it, I mean, the world is a very different place if you don't win Super Bowls as a quarterback. You're measured different. You're looked at different. I mean, Dan Fouts, as great as he was, is not probably viewed as one of the top 10 quarterbacks of all time. And it's because, even though he's in the Hall of Fame, because he doesn't have a title, right? But if he had a title, the view of Dan Fouts would probably be very different. Yeah, I mean, Bob Greasy is in the Hall of Fame primarily because he won 2 Super Bowls, even though he wasn't a great thrower. He was a great field general, right? So I think based on that, if Elway doesn't get those titles, I think he still probably goes into the Hall of Fame. But it's no lock lead pipe cinch, because his numbers, even by those days, are great, but not stupendous. Like, they're not Marino's numbers. They're not even really Kelly's numbers. It's probably a different discussion. And, guys like me who grew up watching Elway would have a really hard time telling people, look, if you ever watched Elway, you would watch the most physically gifted guy to ever play that position, the prototype of that position. In terms of both, ability to run combined with ability to throw, combined with intelligence, combined with all this. He's at the top end of all of those. He's not the fastest guy. He's not the greatest scrambler. There are other guys who had arms that were close to as good. There are other guys who are really smart, all that. But I don't think anybody has the collection of talent that Elway had. And that's a wonderful argument. But if there's no titles, it's it's kind of an empty argument. Let's just put it that way.
2 more questions.
Okay.
What quarterback, it could be current or after he retired, game relates to him? Or you could say, hey, he kind of has some John Elway in him.
Well, I would say that there are a couple of guys. I mean, I always thought Andrew Luck had that chance. I mean, look, I'm a Stanford guy, so we were hoping that Luck was going to be the next great one. And it didn't happen, okay? But he had, again, those sort of prototypical qualities of intelligence, arm strength, enough mobility, strength, power, all those kinds of things, size. That you hoped he would be there. Now, it didn't pan out. I think that Cam Newton is a really interesting comparison because of size relative to the rest of the league. You're talking about a very big man with very, very big presence who is a great runner, who has a big arm. Now, I don't know that Cam is as accurate as Elway was, and I don't mean that based on, completion percentage, okay, because that has a lot to do with offensive styles. But that's all really kind of a minor thing. I think that if you draw up what a quarterback is supposed to look like physically in today's game, and the combination of arm strength, the combination of running ability, while he may not be super fast, it looks like Cam Newton to me, because he's big enough and strong enough. Now, I think that the problem for Cam is that he's too much of a runner and his body's been beaten up as a result. And the injuries that he's taken, and he never developed in an offense where the ball got out of his hands fast enough, which is what Elway learned to do later in his career that allowed him to play a little bit longer. But, there's still time in Cam's career to see how it plays out. Hopefully he gets healthy. Hopefully he's able to, stay on the field. But when you run 100 times or more 7 times, which he's done in his first 8 seasons in the league, those dudes on the other side are going to hit you. And they're going to hit you hard, and they're going to make you pay. So it doesn't matter if you're 6'5" and you're 250 pounds. It gets ugly when you run that much. And so Cam's paying a price for having run that much early in his career.
Last question. What do you want your readers to take away from this book?
I want them to understand what it's like for someone like this to have the drive to want to continue to achieve even after they've reached the apex of their profession in their first half of their life, right? Like, if you get to win 2 championships and you make the Hall of Fame in in your first ballot, like most people would look back and say, oh, that's a hell of a professional life. I can just sit back, I can sit back in my backyard and print money for a living and just be John Elway, or I can just be Brett Favre, or I can be, Peyton Manning, and just, life is glorious, right? That wasn't enough. Like, this is a guy who within 2 years of retiring was begging for a job to do personnel with the Broncos. Now, Mike Shanahan wasn't going to agree to that because he thought it would be a distraction. That's his right. I think he's probably somewhat correct. But when that didn't happen, Elway didn't say, well, I guess my chance is gone. I'm not going to do it. He said, okay, I'll take the challenge at the Arena League. Let's do this. Let's do this for 6 years. I will learn. I will show you people that I'm going to learn to do this, even at a place where nobody's paying attention, right?
Right.
And, because nobody cares about the Arena League. I mean, it was okay, John Elway owns an Arena League team and they won a championship once in 6 years. Oh, that's a cool story. And then you don't think about it again. Meanwhile, he's sitting there and he's honing his craft and he's saying, look, I'm preparing for this opportunity to get back into the NFL. And most people in his position wouldn't do that. Most people in his position wouldn't put their legacy on the line. But for John Elway, it wasn't about wanting to or needing to. It was both. He wanted it and he needed that. And he needed that chase. And at age 50, he needed to come back and he needed to do this. And at age 60, he still needs to do this, even though he's also won a Super Bowl now as an executive. And he could walk off and go, look, people, who's ever done what I've done? Nobody, there's only two people, I should say, not nobody. There's only two people in the history of the league who've ever won a title as a player, made the Hall of Fame, and then come back as either a top executive or a head coach and won a Super Bowl. And that's John Elway and Mike Ditka. He's in rare air, but he still wants to do it. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's fascinating that anybody still chases it as hard as they do at this age when they have so much opportunity to do whatever else they want to do.
Well, Jason, man, I appreciate you doing this, man.
Likewise. I appreciate you taking the time, Ramon.
Elway, man, this is a really great read. We could have went more into the executive side, but I'm going to let the readers do that part.
Thank you very much. Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Go buy it, please. Thank you.
All right.